At 51 years old, Selah Calloway stood in the yard of the only home she had known for 22 years and watched two men from the Agua Seca County Bank nail a notice to her own front gate. She had lost her husband to the winter fever the year before, and now, by order of Colonel Josiah Pratt, who held the note on the Calloway ranch and had called it due with a suddenness that left no room for mercy, she lost the land too. All she carried away in her wagon was $41 sewn into the lining of her coat, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a grief so quiet it barely showed on her face. 3 days later, at a sheriff's sale on the edge of a town so parched the wells had gone to mud, she spent $9 of those dollars on something no one else would touch, a derelict steamship called the Meridian, sitting stranded and cracked in a riverbed that had not held water in 3 long years. It was, by every measure, a fool's purchase. But sealed somewhere within that rotting hull was a secret that would return the river to its people, and change the fate of a woman the town had already written off. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Selah Calloway. If you're watching this from a place that has ever felt forgotten, dried up, or written off by everyone around it, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Selah had been born Selah Winters in 1836, in a modest farmhouse outside of Victoria, Texas, the third of 6 children to a father who mended wagon wheels for a living and a mother who took in mending of a different kind, stitching torn dresses and darning stockings for half the families in the county. It was from her mother that Selah learned the quiet dignity of the overlooked trade, that a thing patched with care was often stronger at the seam than it had been before it tore. Her mother used to say, with a needle between her teeth, that nothing broken was ever truly finished, only waiting for someone patient enough to look at it twice. Selah took this lesson to heart in a way that shaped the whole of her life, long before she understood what it would someday mean. She grew into a girl who could not walk past a bent nail without straightening it, who kept jars of buttons salvaged from worn-out coats, who read the discarded newspapers of neighbors twice over because she could not bear to see anything, information included, go to waste. At 19 she married Thomas Calloway, a rancher with sunburned hands and a gentle laugh, who had inherited 800 acres of scrub and mesquite along the Rio Paloma from his own father, and who saw in Selah not a housewife to be managed but a partner whose eye for value he trusted more than his own. Together they built the ranch into something respectable, if never wealthy, cattle that grazed the river bottoms in the wet seasons, a modest herd of dairy cows, a garden that Selah tended with the same patient attention her mother had given to torn hems. Thomas used to tease her that she could find profit in a pile of ash, and more than once she had proven him right, mending harnesses that other ranchers threw away, buying broken-down wagons at auction and coaxing them back to service, turning other men's discards into the quiet machinery of their household. It was not glamorous work. It rarely earned praise. But it built, slowly and without fanfare, a life that Selah was proud of, a marriage built on the shared understanding that value was not always where it appeared to be, and that patience was its own kind of wealth. They never had children who lived past infancy, a sorrow the two of them carried together without ever needing to speak of it at length, and in later years this absence bound them closer rather than further apart, for they had only each other to lean upon, and they leaned well. Thomas often said that the ranch itself was their child, the thing they had built and fed and worried over, and Selah agreed, pouring into the land and the animals and the modest house the same devotion another woman might have given to a nursery. She learned to read a ledger as well as any banker, kept meticulous records of every calf born and every dollar spent, and though the Calloway ranch never grew large, it grew sound, the kind of quiet, unspectacular success that survives lean years because it never overreached in the good ones. It was during one of the good years, in 1879, when the Rio Paloma still ran wide and generous through the valley every spring, that a shallow draft steamship called the Meridian first came chugging up the river channel from the coastal towns, carrying bolts of cloth, tools, mail, and once, memorably, a piano for the Baptist church in Agua Seca. The whole town turned out to see it dock at the little wharf below the courthouse, and Selah, then a woman of 43 with silvering hair and a child's wonder still intact somewhere beneath her practicality, had stood at the rail with Thomas's arm around her and watched the boat's captain, a broad, quiet man named Elias Boone, tip his hat to the gathered crowd as though they were the ones doing him a kindness by watching. She remembered thinking, with no particular reason, that there was something almost sacred in the sight of a boat that connected a small, dusty town to the wider world beyond it, a lifeline of water and commerce that made the isolation of the frontier feel less absolute. She could not have known then how many years later that same boat would come to mean everything to her survival. The fall, when it came, arrived not suddenly but in a series of smaller losses that Selah would only later understand as the opening moves of a longer ruin. It began with the drought of 1884, a dry season that stretched into a dry year, and then, more strangely, into a river that seemed to shrink even when the rains finally returned. Upstream, Colonel Josiah Pratt, a cattle baron and the principal shareholder of the Agua Seca County Bank, had begun construction on what he called an irrigation reservoir for his own vast holdings at Pratt's Crossing, a dam of earth and stone that swelled his private ponds even as the Rio Paloma below it thinned to a trickle and then, in the worst years, to nothing but cracked mud and the bleached bones of catfish. The steamship Meridian, caught downstream one autumn when the water dropped with unnatural speed, found itself grounded for good in what had once been a deep channel bend just outside of Agua Seca, its hull settling crookedly into the drying silt as the town watched its lifeline to the coast disappear before their eyes. Captain Boone himself vanished not long after. Some said drowned trying to free his boat, others said he simply walked off into the scrublands rather than watch his vessel die by inches, and the truth of it was never settled by anyone who remained in town to ask. Thomas Calloway fell ill in the winter that followed, a fever that the drought's foul water seemed to carry through half the county, and though Selah nursed him with every remedy she knew and every dollar she could spare on a doctor from San Antonio, he did not recover. He died in February of 1886, in the same bed where they had spent 31 years of marriage, and Selah buried him on a rise above the dry riverbed where he had always liked to watch the water when there had been water to watch. She believed, in her grief, that the worst of her trials had passed. She did not yet know that Thomas had, in the last 2 lean years of drought, borrowed against the ranch to keep the cattle fed, and that the note now sat in Colonel Pratt's ledger with a due date that Pratt, learning of Thomas's death, saw fit to accelerate rather than extend. Selah pleaded her case before the bank's board, offered a payment schedule, offered to sell off half the herd, offered anything reasonable a widow of 51 might offer, but Pratt, a man who had built his fortune on other people's misfortune and called it business sense, foreclosed within the month. She was given 3 days to vacate the only home of her adult life, and on a gray morning in March of 1887, she loaded what little the bank did not claim into a borrowed wagon and drove into Agua Seca with no clear notion of where she would sleep that night. It was in this state, hollowed out by grief and stripped of nearly everything she had built, that Selah heard of the sheriff's sale being held that same week to clear the county's books of unclaimed and abandoned property, among them the long derelict hull of the Meridian, still sitting exactly where it had grounded 3 years before, now more curiosity than vessel, its paint peeling, its deck sagging, home to nesting swallows and little else. Nobody bid on it. The auctioneer, a thin man named Purdy with little patience for lost causes, nearly skipped the lot entirely, joking that he would need to pay someone to haul it off rather than expect payment for it. But Selah, standing at the back of the small crowd with her arms folded against the wind and $41 sewn into her coat lining, found herself remembering her mother's needle-worn hands and the lesson stitched into her from childhood, that nothing broken was ever truly finished. She did not know why the boat called to her. She only knew that everyone else had already decided it was worthless, and that this alone made her want to look at it twice. She raised her hand and bid $2, more to see what would happen than from any real plan, and when no one else stirred to challenge her, Purdy let it go for $9 after a half-hearted round of haggling meant only to make the sale look respectable. The crowd laughed, not unkindly, but with the particular pity reserved for a woman who had clearly lost more than her land in recent months, and Selah walked down to the riverbed that same afternoon to look upon what she had bought. The Meridian sat tilted in the cracked mud like a great beached whale, its hull streaked with rust and river silt, its windows fogged with dust, and yet, standing beneath its shadow, Selah felt something she had not expected to feel again so soon after burying her husband, a small, stubborn flicker of purpose. She spent that first afternoon simply walking the boat's perimeter, running her palm along the warped boards of the hull the way she might have run a hand along the flank of a nervous horse, speaking to it under her breath in the same low, steady voice she had once used to calm frightened calves. She found a way aboard through a gap in the collapsed gangway, and inside, amid the dust and the droppings of nesting birds, she discovered the captain's quarters largely undisturbed, as though whoever had last left the boat had done so in a hurry and never returned to claim anything at all. There was a narrow bunk, a sea chest swollen shut with damp, and on the small writing desk bolted to the wall, a logbook whose leather cover had gone soft and gray with age. Selah opened it carefully, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear but from the peculiar reverence she felt for any object that others had discarded, and found the neat, careful hand of Captain Elias Boone recording the mundane business of river commerce, cargo manifests, weather notes, small complaints about the price of coal. But in the final pages, dated in the weeks just before the river had dropped for good, the entries changed in tone, growing tighter and more anxious, referencing a visitor who had come aboard at night, a name mentioned only as the Colonel, and a demand that Boone hand over something the captain called, cryptically, the Valley's paper. Selah read the words twice by the fading afternoon light, understanding nothing of their meaning yet, but sensing, the way she had always sensed value in a broken wagon wheel or a torn hem, that she had found the first thread of something far larger than a derelict boat. For the next several weeks, Selah made her home in a small rented room above the mercantile, taking in sewing and mending to keep herself fed, and spent every spare hour she could steal down at the grounded meridian, working through the boat plank by plank with the same patience her mother had once given to a torn Sunday dress. She cleared the nests, aired out the cabins, and read Captain Boone's logbook from its first entry to its last so many times she could nearly recite it. The final entries haunted her most. Boone had written, in a hand grown increasingly cramped and hurried, that a man calling himself the Colonel had come to him twice in the space of a single week, first with an offer of money that Boone called insulting and then, when refused, with a threat Boone did not commit fully to paper, writing only that he intended to move certain items to a place where no dam and no drought could reach them, before anyone came looking again. After that entry, the logbook simply stopped, its final pages left blank, and Selah understood that whatever Boone had hidden, he had hidden it well, and likely paid for that secrecy with his disappearance. She began searching the ship in earnest, no longer merely cleaning it but interrogating it, tapping along bulkheads for hollow spaces the way she might have tested a wagon axle for a hidden crack, running her hands along seams in the deck boards that seemed newer than the wood around them. It took her the better part of 9 days of careful, unglamorous labor before her persistence was rewarded, in the forward hold beneath a false floor of boards fitted with unusual precision, boards that any casual searcher would have walked over 100 times without noticing the seam. Beneath them she found an iron strongbox, locked but not so heavily as to resist the crowbar she had brought along on the chance her search might finally bear fruit, and inside the strongbox, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp, she found 2 things that would change the course of everything that followed. The first was a leather satchel of currency, several $100s in gold and silver coin, which Boone's final logbook entries revealed to be relief funds collected from cotton shipments over 2 seasons, money meant to be delivered to the town council of Agua Seca for the building of a proper schoolhouse and the digging of a second town well, funds that had never reached their destination because the river dried out from under the boat before Boone could complete his final run. The second item was a folded, water-stained document bearing an official territorial seal from 1852, a water rights charter granted decades earlier by the territorial government, declaring the full flow of the Rio Paloma to be held in common trust for all landholders along its length, expressly forbidding any single party from damming or diverting its course to the detriment of downstream users. Selah sat in the dim hold with the document trembling in her hands, understanding at once, with the same clear instinct that had once told her a broken wagon wheel could still turn true, that she was holding the legal instrument that could undo 3 years of Colonel Pratt's private reservoir and bring the river back to the people who had always been entitled to it. She did not act rashly. Selah had learned patience from her mother's needle and prudence from 31 years managing a working ranch, and she understood that a woman recently widowed, recently foreclosed upon, and now possessed of a document accusing the county's most powerful man of theft on a grand scale would need more than righteousness to prevail. She spent several careful days verifying the charter's authenticity, riding by borrowed horse to the county land office in the neighboring town of Comfort to compare the seal and language against other territorial documents on file, and found, to her quiet satisfaction and mounting unease, that the charter was entirely genuine, filed and recorded in 1852 and never formally revoked by any subsequent legislature. She also learned, through careful questions to the aging clerk who remembered the old river days, that Elias Boone had once served briefly as a surveyor's assistant before turning to riverboat work, which explained how a mere steamship captain had come to possess such a document at all. He had likely recovered it, or been entrusted with it, By an old surveying acquaintance who understood its danger and wanted it kept far from Pratt's reach, aboard a boat that moved constantly in answer to no single town's authority. Word travels quickly in a small county, even word that a woman intends to travel carefully, and it was not long before Colonel Pratt learned that the widow Calloway had bought the old wreck at the sheriff's sale and had been seen aboard it at all hours, working with a purpose that struck several townsfolk as peculiar for a woman they assumed was merely salvaging scrap lumber. Pratt, who had spent 3 years believing whatever boon once hid had either been destroyed by the elements or lost forever when the captain vanished, grew uneasy enough to pay Selah a visit himself, arriving at the mercantile in a fine black coat with an offer that he framed as generosity. $50 for the wreck, more than 5 times what she had paid, a sum he suggested would let a widow of her circumstances start fresh somewhere more forgiving than Agua Seca. Selah, who had learned to read a man's ledger as easily as his face, understood immediately that an offer this large for a rotting hull meant only one thing, that Pratt knew, or feared, exactly what might still be aboard it, and she declined his offer with the same quiet firmness she had once used to refuse an unfair price for cattle. Pratt's civility thinned considerably after that refusal, and within the week Selah began to feel the particular cold that a small town can direct at a woman who has displeased its most powerful citizen. The mercantile owner grew suddenly short with her custom. Her rented room's landlord mentioned, unprompted, that he might need it back for a relative, and 2 men she did not recognize were seen loitering near the dry riverbed after dark on more than one occasion. Selah understood that she could not simply present the charter to the town council and expect justice to follow on the strength of paper alone, not when the man she accused controlled the bank, held notes on half the ranches in the county, and had spent 3 years quietly consolidating the very water that should have belonged to everyone. She needed allies, and she found her first in a judge named Everett Marsh, recently arrived to preside over the county circuit court, a man not yet beholden to Pratt's influence and known to take a dim view of the Colonel's reservoir, having lost his own modest orchard downstream to the drought 2 summers past. She also found an ally in Reverend Amos Whitfield of the very Baptist church whose piano the Meridian had once delivered, a man who remembered the town's better days on the river and who agreed to help her gather affidavits from old-timers who could speak to the river's former course and the community's long-standing reliance upon it. Slowly, carefully, over the course of nearly 3 weeks, Selah built her case not as an act of vengeance against the man who had cast her from her home, but as a plain restoration of what had always, by law and by decency, belonged to the valley entire. Pratt did not yield easily. When it became clear that Selah intended to bring the charter before Judge Marsh's court, he attempted first to buy the silence of the land office clerk in comfort, an effort that backfired when the clerk, offended by the clumsiness of the bribe, instead wrote to Agua Seca himself to swear to the document's authenticity before witnesses. Pratt next tried to argue.